Okay. First, I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to present our paper, which is called Life in Shackles, the quantitative implications of reforming the educational financing system, which is joint work with two co-authors, Ben Hydra and Laurien Reinders, who are both from the University of Groningen. So I think I don't have to tell people in that room a lot that obtaining college education actually requires a large investment of time and money. I think we know that so far. And because students might potentially not be able to bring up that money that is necessary to finance higher education up front, so most governments have instituted some kinds of education financing system. If you look across countries, you would actually see that there's a huge variety of how these systems are designed. So the US runs basically in a standard, what we could probably call a US mortgage loan system. Australia is running a system in which repayments to loans are somewhat income contingent. And then for the European countries, for example, the Netherlands has a system of financial aid to students, which is basically giving basic grants that are financed out of general tax money. So what's the problem with standard sort of education mortgage loan financing system? There might be a problem. On the one hand, they are good because they sort of guarantee access to education for people who don't have a lot of resources to bring up front, to pay for their cost of education. On the other hand, students might end up with a large amount of study debt, and repaying this large amount of study debt might be painful for them when they are experiencing unlucky times in the labor market, right? When there is a considerable amount of output risk for students, you might take up some education and you might go into the labor market and figure out, okay, my return to education is actually pretty small, or I might feature some periods of unemployment, and that would put me under stress to repay my loan. Okay, to phrase that with the words of The Economist, in 2011, there was an article that basically said student loans are often badly designed for extended periods of high unemployment. In contrast to the housing crash, the risk from student debt is not of a sudden explosion, but explosion in losses, but at a gradual financial suffocation. This pressure needs to be eased. So what that part phrases is basically the fear that when you become a student and you're left over with a large amount of study loan after you have studied and have to pay that, you might potentially live what we could call a life in shackles. So living with a problem that you have to come up with a lot of repayments of your educational loan in the end when you're pretty unlucky in the labor market. Though, I mean, the literature, we as economists have solutions for this problem, right? So when you look at the theoretical literature, or we think we have solutions for the problem, when you look at the theoretical literature, this literature would mostly promote income-dependent or income-contingent financing schemes for education. And why would that be? Basically, you want to have these systems because you might insure parts of the risks that are associated with education, input risk, output risk, whatever is out there. And you might think of implementing such an income-dependent financing scheme in two ways. There might be a private solution to this, right? So in essence, this goes back to the ideas of Friedman about education financing. So what he would tell you is basically students should be able ex ante to sell a share of their income, almost like some equity on their future performance in the labor market to investors, and the money they get from that they could use to pay for their education. Although we know, Lance has a paper on that and there are some other papers on that, we know that there are a couple of complications coming with these private arrangements. There might be default, limited enforcement, as we've just seen. It might be costly for private investors to actually monitor some people's incomes. So there are a couple of issues there. On the other hand, you might think that there might be public arrangement where the government basically institutes an income-dependent financing scheme for grants to students, an income-dependent financing scheme for higher education. And why might that be favorable? It might be favorable because the government already has the ability to tax people, and especially to tax college graduates. Okay? So in this paper, we want to focus on the latter schemes because then we don't have to deal too much in our paper with all of these kinds of problems. So what we want to do is we want to do a quantitative analysis of different education financing schemes that are income dependent and that are instituted by the government. What we start out with is a situation that in a stylized way mimics the United States. So you're going to have a system in which you can borrow. You have an educational loan system in which you can borrow, and in the end you're going to end up with a certain amount of loan that you then have to pay back in the labor market. This is sort of our status quo system. And what we're looking at is systems that finance grant to students. This is going to be our reform cases, our counterfactual, that finance grant to students in the same amount as students had been able to borrow money in the mortgage loan system. And these grants to students can be financed in 3 different ways. We're thinking of 3 different systems. Like, for example, in the Netherlands, where grants to students are just financed out of general tax money. They might be financed by what the literature calls graduate taxes. So they might be financed by a tax that is only levied on people that have spent some time in higher education. Or the system we're going to endorse in the end is going to be a degree-specific tax, where sort of the tax burden varies with the number of years you actually spend in higher education. Let me be a little more specific about all of these things later on. So let me just give you a quick preview of the results. So what we find is that quantitatively, a move to either a graduate or a degree-specific tax scheme can actually increase aggregate welfare. Yes?
Why aren't you worried about the moral hazard problem? This would cause a lot more people to become English majors.
Yeah. So there is a considerable amount of incentives that these schemes are going to put. So we will see that some of these incentives can seriously distort the education decision of households. And what we're also going to look at, which is also going to be important, they're going to distort the labor supply decisions and potentially future human capital decisions, because you're imposing a tax on people. You're taking away part of their return, in essence. So all of that is going to be in there. And we're trying to quantify, sort of, to trade off all these things from a quantitative perspective, because we think the theoretical literature has focused maybe on one part or the other, but we want to bring all these things kind of together. That's it. That's
do we have any analysis on asymmetric information problem? Or?
No, we don't. So, the thing is essentially, households can choose whether to enter the education sector. They're going to completely know, okay, this is the system I'm financing my education with, so this is going to be my future payment. They might be either income dependent or not, but the government has no way of monitoring students' abilities. So the government can just sort of verify students' income and collect part of that. That's the assumption we're operating under. Because like introducing all that moral hazard problem into a large general equilibrium simulation model, is a little tricky, but that's certainly an avenue to go in the future. Okay, so, and that welfare gain that we find from moving to graduate or degree-specific taxes, although it is small, it exists, and we find that because sort of the risk-sharing benefits that these systems, these income system contingent systems provide, plus some positive education incentives effect they pose, those 2 systems, not the comprehensive tax system, they kind of outweigh all kinds of labor supply distortions these income contingent systems create. So the other thing we find is that sort of comparing only long-run steady states and considerable transitional dynamics is important when you want to reform sort of this education system, because we actually find that the reforms we make are going to create a considerable amount of transitional dynamics. Okay, so there is a literature out there. Most of that is theoretical. There's also a literature about studying education subsidies in incomplete market. Maybe there's one paper I should cite just for Brand and Giovanni sitting in that room. That's sort of the paper of Abbott, Gallipoli, McGeary, and Violante. What their paper does is more studying sort of the times of education and paying close focus on what is the liquidity constraints exactly people have, what is intergenerational transfers, and what happens when I give a little more money to students, and how is that going to impact on the education decisions. What we're after a little more is we're going to be a little more stylized on the education phase, and therefore pay a lot of attention to modeling what people face actually after the times of study, so what influences their return and all the risk that is associated with education. Okay, so let me quickly talk about the model. We're going to study an overlapping generations model with heterogeneous individuals. Demographics are going to be relatively simple here, so lifespan is certain. You start living with the age of 0 and you're going to die at the age of 80. Population grows at a constant rate, and households make a couple of decisions. So households, first of all, can choose at the beginning of their life, when they mature, they come out of high school, they can choose how many years to stay in higher education, and they can choose from a menu of degrees. Actually, there are going to be several degrees they can choose from that have a different number of years of education. When they enter the labor force after education, they can choose how many hours of labor to supply. And by supplying labor, they are not only going to generate instantaneous income, but they're also going to have a learning by doing mechanism, meaning when they work a lot in the labor market, they can learn a little more about how whatever job they are doing works, and this is going to create an additional increase in human capital over the life cycle. So there's basically two ways of forming human capital in that model. One would be, let's say, a learning or doing technology, which is higher education, and then there's learning by doing technology when you're in the job in the market.
Do they pay for this learning?
Sorry?
Do they pay for this learning by doing?
No, they don't.
Free lunch.
No, it's a free lunch. So in the end, they can also choose their consumption savings. That's basically what people do. And they make these choices on a couple of heterogeneity or a couple of risks. So first, there's going to be very many different individual abilities of learning. We index them by 0 on a continuous interval by 0 to 1. Then, when people enter the labor force, as we're going to see, they're going to draw from a on-the-job learning ability, right? So they're going to be either good or bad on-the-job learners, which is going to impact sort of the growth rates of human capital over the life cycle. And last but not least, agents are going to experience labor productivity shocks throughout their working life that are evolving stochastically over the life cycle, that are autocorrelated. So to just quickly sort of sketch the model in a graph, I'm going to be more detailed about the actual choice problem in a second. So basically, that's the life cycle. You die at 0. You're born at 0. You die at the age of 80. At a certain date, you mature. That would be the age of 18. Which we call majority. At that point in time, you're going to draw your educational ability, and conditional on this educational ability, you're going to make a choice about your education, how many years to spend in education, which will define your education phase. At the end of this education phase, you're going to draw your ability to learn on the job, and that ability to learn on the job is going to be correlated with your educational ability. So we assume like people who perform well in the education sector are also not going to be the worst learners in the market, but there is some sort of imperfect correlation. And then you start out with that learning by doing parameter, you start out your working phase, and you're going to face a series of idiosyncratic shocks, and you can choose your labor supply, and obviously you can also choose your consumption and your savings. Okay, so we basically have two problems to study here. Essentially, we're solving that model backwards, so we have to study the problem of a worker, and we have to study the problem of a student, how he actually chooses his optimal amount of years of education. Yes?
Policies, are you doing it ex ante?
We're doing it ex ante, right? So there's going to be very different
heterogeneity, like ex ante heterogeneity,
yes,
not being taken into account in the policy.
It is, right? So
everybody's ex ante identical.
Not everybody's ex ante identical, but sort of they form expectations about whatever.
Yeah, but they all have the same expectation.
They all have the same expectation. Everybody.
But not when they enter the education phase, right? So
Right,
the education decision is going to be contingent on your realization of your and your knowledge.
But when you evaluate policies,
Yes.
Are you evaluating at 0 or at n?
At 0.
Everybody's
Or
identical.
so everybody is ex ante identical, right? And if you are risk averse towards this.
I just wanted to know.
Yeah, no. But yeah, okay.
That's how you're.
That's what we're doing. That's sort of our concept. Okay, so we basically have a problem to solve for the worker and a problem to solve for a student. So what does the problem of the worker look like? We can write down a Bellman equation for that. What is the state of a worker? The state of a worker is basically the amount of years he spent in education. This is going to define his or her degree. The ability by how much or how good you are able to form human capital through the on-the-job learning, on-the-job training, on-the-job learning. Then you're going to have assets, individual human capital, and your current shock to your labor productivity. So, and households are going to maximize essentially their discounted sum of utilities, taking proper expectations about how this labor productivity is going to potentially change in the future, and this process is going to depend on education, basically mimicking that unemployment probabilities are going to depend on your education level. When you're a high school worker, you have a higher probability of being unemployed. You form expectations about this eta, your gamma is going to be constant over the life cycle, and then you decide about how much to consume today, how much to work, and then you have a budget constraint which is going to tell you, okay, given net assets plus net interest and your labor income, which is just the product of the wage rate your individual productivity, shock your human capital and your labor hours. A potential unemployment benefit when you're unemployed, minus your consumption, and minus, this is just a shortcut for whatever you pay back in terms of your student loan. Right? This is going to define how much assets you have tomorrow. And as I said, there's going to be a law of motion for human capital. So there's two effects to human capital. One would just be that human capital is going to depreciate over time, and this depreciation is going to be age dependent. So there's going to be more depreciation in the end of the life cycle than in the beginning. And there's going to be a learning by doing technology, which basically tells you if you work in the labor market, this is going to increase your human capital, but at decreasing returns to scale. We need these decreasing returns to scale because later on in the data, we actually want to look at human capital growth rates and the variance of human capital growth rates. And the variance of human capital growth rates is essentially going to be defined by this alpha parameter. And then sort of the higher is your gamma, the more productive you are in forming human capital on the job, and the steeper your wage profile is going to be over the lifetime. What's the problem of a student? The student at the beginning of life can choose from basically 4 amounts of education. No education, which would mean you drop out after high school and go into the labor market. You can have 2, 4, and 6 years of education. What does education mean? Education basically means you're going to have some smaller amount of consumption, and you have to spend some time going to university, which is not your leisure time. And you have to form expectations essentially about your learning by doing parameter, how that's going to, which draw and expectation you're going to get from this distribution of learning by doing parameters, which is going to be conditional on your own ability in education. And then you have to form expectations about what your utility is when you enter the labor force, given your education level, given your gamma or your expectation. You're going to enter with 0 assets, a certain level of human capital, which is going to be defined in an instant. And we assume for simplicity that the initial shock to labor productivity is going to be 1. So then you have a budget constraint. Your budget constraint basically reads your consumption.
Clarify.
Yes.
The only impact of education is basically it's affecting your expectation of your draw of gamma. Is that?
And your human capital level. So if you stay longer in human capital, contingent on your educational ability, you're going to enter the economy with different human capital. And we assume this functional form, which basically tells you the higher your ability, the more human capital you're going to get. But there's going to be some decreasing returns to scale, and the decreasing returns to scale is going to vary across the people. We need that basically to ensure monotonic education decisions in theta. Okay? Yes?
There's no borrowing or saving while you're in school?
There's no borrowing or saving. You just eat up what you get, and what you get is basically your loan. And you would have to pay some tuition from that. That's sort of the simplifying assumption we're imposing on the education sector in order to be able to model a little more on the working phase.
You can think of policies that would shift that theory too, or not?
Our policies are going to keep. So the intention is our policies is going to keep that constant, right? So the idea is just to vary the mode of repayment and keep that constant, because otherwise we would probably not be sort of satisfied with the way we set up the model. But we want to keep sort of this dimension of just like increasing or decreasing the amount of money you have when you're going to study. We want to keep that constant. Okay? So there's going to be this a general equilibrium model. So there's going to be essentially 3 more actors in the model. The one actor would be the mortgage loan system, which in our benchmark economy is just going to be a system in which the repayments you have to make during your working phase are in present value just going to be equal to the amount of loan you have taken up. So this is a pure standard borrowing system. We assume that interest payments are deductible from income taxes, but this does not influence the results very much, or not at all even. So then we have a government, and the government taxes consumption and income to finance a certain exogenous stream of public consumption and some unemployment benefits. And then we need a firm sector to actually close that model, where firms are modeled very, very standard here. So they act in competitive markets, hiring both capital and effective labor or human capital using a codiagnosticometry. Okay, so let me quickly talk about how we calibrate that model. There's a lot of things to actually calibrate here, and we're going to do that in 2 steps. So we take a couple of parameters, which we either take sort of as standard from the literature, or we try to pin them down directly in the data. That's our first step. And in the second step, we're still left over with a substantial number of parameters that we're trying to calibrate such that we match what we think is important target moments from the data. I'm not going to be too detailed about these things. I'm going to name you a couple of moments we have. I would refer you to the paper for actual more details on that. So what sort of an excerpt of step 1, what we choose is the risk aversion for individuals of 4, which is well within the range of what is used in macroeconomic models studying redistributive policy. We choose an autocorrelation parameter of productivity shocks of 0.8, which basically draws on the work of Fatih Guvinin, saying once you account for different growth rates in human capital over the life cycle, the persistence of idiosyncratic income shocks might actually be much lower than what sort of the standard life cycle literature has estimated, which would be rather something like 0.98. We use unemployment probabilities from the CPS. We allow for a quick grace period before you can repay your student loans, which would be about 4 years, because sort of in our model, that's a useful thing to do because you get all these shocks to labor productivity and you cannot defer loan payments. We cannot track of you deferring loan payments, which would be the case if you were unemployed in the United States. So we give people a couple of years to first build up some buffer stock savings, because otherwise, at that period where they would enter the labor market, they would just work like crazy because they would have to build up a huge amount of buffer stock for the likelihood of becoming unemployed in exactly the next period. Okay, step 2, sort of moments. We think important moments we include into the calibration procedure would be a capital output ratio of 3, the consumption and income tax revenue in the United States, the education composition of the population in 2011 from the CPS. We have average labor productivity profiles by education level for people who are high school graduates and who have some college education, which we're trying to match. We're trying to match all-day labor force participation, because this is going to in part identify how the depreciation of human capital varies over the life cycle. As I said, we're going to take a look at the variance of income or productivity growth rates over the life cycle to identify the decreasing returns to scale in our on-the-job learning technology. And we're going to take a look at the evolution of the variance of labor earnings by age. Okay? To just give you a quick idea on how our model or the distribution of talent and education decisions, for example, look in our model. We assume that this distribution is truncated, but we don't want it to be uniform. We actually want it to have some flexibility, so we're taking a truncated normal distribution here. What we see in terms of educational talent, there's going to be a large mass of people out here who basically choose 0 education. Then there's going to be some people that choose 2 years of education in the middle. There's actually going to sort of, the threshold by which you choose 6 years of education is already going to be at 0.6, but there's hardly any people out there. So what does that give us in terms of the education distribution? You see whatever our model generates here in the first column and what the data says in the CPS on the education composition of the population in 2011. So we get a pretty good match, and especially we get sort of the fact that not only a large number of people choose 0 years of education, but there's also going to be sort of a hump here where people primarily choose 4 years of education and less so 2 and 6 or more years of education. This is sort of the average labor productivity profiles by education for people without college education and with some college education. So the crosses are the data, the blue lines are whatever our model generates. Note that sort of out here, we perform less well than the data, though sort of this data is estimated just from the remaining sample that is out there at the age of 65, so there might be some selection going on which is not accounted for in these profiles. So we think as people start retiring, the average labor productivity profiles should decrease again. This is the variance of log labor earnings, so we get this typical feature that we already know from life cycle studies, that the variance of log labor earnings is quite relatively low at the beginning, because it mainly features differences in human capital that people have formed during their education phase, and then it rapidly increases as people start facing more and more idiosyncratic productivity shocks. And as sort of the growth, because the growth profile of labor productivity is different across people, this is going to lead to this sharp increase in the variance of log labor earnings. Okay, and then you see sort of the labor hour profiles, which are pretty standard. So people work about, on average, until the age of 50 at least, or 55, work a 40 hours work week on average, and then sort of after the age of 60, people are slowly going to start retiring. And that leads to these labor income profiles, which are very steep for people with a high number of education years, and which are relatively flat for people with a lower amount of education. Okay. So that's the setup we're studying reforms of the education system in. So what's our thought experiment? I already said it in the beginning. We're going to start out from that just equilibrium that I just described, where people basically just have standard loans to finance their education. And we're only going to assume that this loan system is going to be replaced by a system that is administered by the government, and in which the government will give grants to students in exactly the way as the student loan system did before, in exactly the size. So the resources you have at the beginning of your life cycle, when you choose your number of study years, are going to be exactly the same between the two systems, but the system is going to be administered on a pay-as-you-go basis. So the government collects taxes from people who are already in the labor market and uses them to finance education. And it can do so by different tax schemes. So the first thing would be it can do so by just financing these grants to students out of general tax money, by just financing it out of taxes on people who had at least some education. That would be the standard graduate tax system, and by administering degree-specific taxes, which would take into account that when you are in education for 4 years or 6 years, you're going to generate different costs, and therefore you should potentially pay higher taxes than a person that has only been in education for 2 years. Thanks to Lance for that suggestion, by the way. We do not only calculate long-run equilibrium outcomes of that, but we also calculate a full transition path, which we think is necessary to sort of study the overall welfare effects of this.
So what's the government know about the agent's ability? You're subsidizing at different years of school. You're going to give these guys a price schedule. What do you know? What does the government know? I guess what do you?
The government observes incomes.
Just incomes.
Just incomes.
Okay.
So they cannot say I can condition your loan system on your ability. That's not possible here. The government only can ex post verify how much income you have, which would be sort of a.
No, I'm talking about the grant too. I mean the grant. How is the government making its grant decision?
The grants are going to be. You can get a grant. You can go to the government and can get a grant. It's your choice, and the government would give you the grant. Okay, there's no difference in that in the government saying, okay, you cannot go to education, but you can go to education.
But there's no ability. There's no like. You're not going to reward it to somebody who has more. So a mental retard can get a loan here. It's the same as a genius.
That's the assumption.
Okay,
yes.
fine. You think that might be kind of an inefficient way to target these loans, grants?
Yes, for sure. And this sort of I totally agree. Which will also sort of tell you already why a comprehensive tax system is not going to be the best choice you can make. Because when you make a comprehensive tax system, you're going to lead these people of low ability into the education sector, because sort of prices change so much for them that they just would want to go into education. Of course, the government. I mean, we could drive that further and say, okay, what if the government can at least partly monitor people and can keep people out of the education sector? But we haven't done that for now, but it's a good suggestion for driving that a little further. Yes?
You don't have initial heterogeneity in either assets or human capital, right, at age 18?
No, yeah.
So how costly are these missing markets? Just do you have a sense for what the first best might be like?
Actually, I don't know. I would think a little more about that. Okay, but it's a good point. Okay, so that's our thought experiment. Let me quickly tell you how these tax systems are going to look like and what their impact on the long-run education distribution of the population is going to be. So the first, for each of the three systems, comprehensive tax, graduate tax, degree tax, this is what the structure of education taxes looks like. So in the comprehensive tax system, people would have to be taxed at a 1.56% additional rate to basically finance all these grants to students that have to be paid. In the graduate tax system, obviously the population that only has a high school degree is not going to be burdened with the cost of education, but the tax is just going to be administered on college graduates, which would then obviously be higher. It would be at 2.37%. And in the degree tax system, where you basically take into account that when you're a 2-year student, you're causing less cost than a 6-year student, the tax rates would actually be increasing from about 1% to 2.67% on people who have a 6-year degree of education. Obviously, implementing these schemes is going to have incentives. It's going to put incentives for more or less education on different people. Why? Because when the cost of education is sort of distributed across the whole population, whether you're educated or not, many people would think, okay, I probably don't have the highest return on education, but I have to pay for the cost anyway. So why not take up at least some education? And therefore, sort of the number of high school graduates is going to decrease dramatically from that. And people are going to consistently get a higher education, so that we see a consistent movement of people up to a higher education. Which in the end is going to turn out not to be, of course, not to be the efficient thing, but that's going to come later. If we administer a gradient tax system, obviously the incentives for the low educated guys are not going to vary too much, right? Therefore, we see that sort of, their education choices hardly are affected by the system. But still, for people with with at least some education, we have the same problem as we have here, but only within this group of E greater 0 people, that choosing a higher number of years of education is not going to impact on the taxes you pay. So therefore, again, we see sort of a consistent increase in the number of students, and it would be important later on to figure out whether this is actually an efficient thing to do or not. Finally, when we have a degree tax system, we can already see that sort of this degree tax system leads to a partial decrease in the number of high school graduates, but these additional people flowing into the education sector are going to be much more equally distributed across the different fields. And we think, and it's going to turn out, that this is potentially a good thing to do. I mean, depending on why you think people were not getting into the education sector in the first place, if the reason for that would be that the return on education is just too risky, and now you're reducing the risk of education, bringing these people back into the education sector, this could actually be a positive thing or an efficient thing to do. But we're going to quantify that later on. Okay, let me quickly talk about the macro effects. So in terms of long-run labor supply, we're going to see that long-run labor supply is going to increase for the first two reforms, which is basically a result of people going more into the education sector. You got more human capital in the overall population. So this is going to increase the amount of labor, while in the DT case, this is not the case. Why is that not the case? You have a counteracting force against this increase in human capital because you have labor supply distortions, right? Administering taxes is going to create labor supply distortions and then counteract this increase in human capital formation, and the effect is going to be stronger in the DT system. The capital stock is going to increase. Why is the capital stock going to increase? Most importantly, because we are replacing a mortgage loan system, which is a debt system, with a pay-as-you-go system, which basically means that in the end we're going to get rid of part of the debt of students, which increases overall capital. And output and consumption are going to sort of move in the same direction as these two aggregates. Factor prices then obviously have to counterbalance that, so the wage rate is going to increase by 5.5%. all throughout the three simulations, and interest rates are going to decrease slightly. Okay, but that's not like the full part of the story. For the full part of the story, we would potentially want to look at, okay, what's happening along the transition if we change from one system to the other. And here you can see what happens to labor supply along the transition. This is actually in sort of human capital models where you have a learning or doing technology, right, which would be higher education. This is not too surprising. If you see the overall the overall amount of human capital increasing in the future, people must stay in the education sector in the short run, which actually will depress labor supply in the short run because all these people that go into education stay away from the labor market. Okay, that's what you see, and then you just see a successive increase in labor hours for the two cases, gradient and comprehensive taxes, and less so for the degree tax system. In terms of capital, we get a similar movement, so we know that capital is going to increase in the future, but sort of this movement is going to be gradual. Capital is a slow-moving stock where people have to make investments, which is ultimately going to increase the capital stock. And then sort of combining these two movements, the movement for consumption is all not so surprising, that people are going to have less consumption, especially during times where they stay longer in education. And then the increase in human capital in the long run is actually going to increase consumption, at least in the comprehensive and the gradient tax case. Okay, that's sort of what the macroeconomic features of that are. But sort of we're studying systems that are creating a certain amount of redistribution between people, so we would potentially want to figure out, okay, what are the welfare effects of this? Yes?
You have to worry about the production function for schooling.
Yes.
So what's happening there? For example, as more people go into education, you have to have more professors or other...
Okay, yeah. No, that's true. That's true. So there is no formal education production sector here that might be influenced by the number of students, which would certainly be a problem for the comprehensive tax case, right? No, I see that point, which would make sort of that case. We're going to find out that case is bad in terms of welfare. Would potentially make that case even worse. Okay.
say again, how did those taxes get chosen? I mean, is there a balanced budget?
Okay. There's a balanced budget requirement. So you know how many grants have been given out to students. So you know the total amount of money that needs to be collected. And then you can write out a balanced budget condition, taking different chunks of the population, taking the whole population and collecting taxes from them, or taking only the number of graduates and taking taxes from them, or conditioning, taking all the grants that have been given out to two-year students and comparing them to the income of two-year students, and so on and so forth. But it's all balanced budget.
There's no choice to try to make things better, right? There's no optimal.
No, there's no optimal. So one of the things we want to do potentially in the future is sort of consider like a basic allowance tax schedule where you can at least have some freedom of choice, but so far that's not in there. But that's certainly also an avenue to go to even probably push the risk-sharing benefits a little further.
And then these transition dynamics, it's just a balanced budget over the full horizon, or the tax rate's changing?
The tax rate's changing every year.
Over every year.
Right? Which will burden...
So you're screwing the guys that went before.
Yes.
And went, okay, and they also.
So you could, I mean, yeah.
Pay their loan off, their mortgage loan, and they have to pay this, or you just.
Yes, that's exactly what's going to happen. Though, sort of our aggregate welfare measure is taking these different effects into account and trying to figure out, okay, can we at least in principle compensate the people in the short run from that? So we have an aggregate welfare measure that kind of satisfies Ricardian equivalence, which means you could sort of figure out, can we redistribute the burden? Could we redistribute the burden across people in a way that we could make the short-run people as well off as they were initially, and then at least generate another benefit for the long-run people. You could also potentially try to do that with public debt, right? You can try a conversion between like private debt and public debt. It's a little sensitive at the moment to talk about these things where the government is going to take over debt from students, actually, I think, or from anyone in the world where we're suffering relatively high capital stocks at the moment. Okay, so what's our notion of welfare here? Yes. What's our notion of welfare here? We're going to calculate welfare as compensating transfers. So we're going to look at a household that is affected by that reform and compare this house, or at a cohort that's affected by this reform. We're going to look at their ex-ante welfare, like right before the minutes where they were born, they don't know their educational ability yet, and compare them to sort of the cohort counterpart in the initial equilibrium. And then we have sort of we have a welfare level for the one guys and welfare level for the other guys, and we're going to calculate a wealth transfer we would have to give this cohort that is affected by the reform so as to make it as well off as the comparison cohort in the initial equilibrium. Why is that a good measure? I think this is I have a paper on that. I think this is a good measure because you calculate sort of monetary equivalent of a wealth transfer, which you can easily sum up across generations. While summing up just welfare effects measured in consumption equivalent variation across generations is pretty tough. Okay, and the negative of this transfer is going to be an indicator of a welfare effect. Why the negative? If I have to take wealth away from you when you were affected by the reform, this is going to mean that you're better off from this reform, right? So we use the negative of these transfers, and to make them to transform them in a useful measure, we relate them just to initial equilibrium consumption. So you get out sort of a consumption compensating variation measure out of this procedure. And as Lan said, this is exactly what's happening, right? We're changing a loan system into a pay-as-you-go system. So we're going to find that short-run generations are going to be burdened by that reform. We could alleviate part of the burden, as I said before, by sort of trying to finance things by a mix of taxes and debt. We chose to just go over sort of in the most straightforward, direct way between the system, which is going to burden short-run generations, because the short-run generations do have to pay the same burden in a sense twice. They are still left over with part of their mortgage, and they're going to be burdened by higher taxes on their labor income. Yes?
Because you could essentially just flip absolve them of their mortgage and then figure out the tax rate that's going to generate it. So it would just be switch. That's what I'm trying to figure out. What do you do with those guys? So I'm done with school. I've got this. I'm supposed to be paying $5,000 every year.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
I could just say, well, no, we're gonna just switch it all to a tax system. Mm-hmm. You didn't know that, so the guys that are really rich get screwed on that deal. But
so you would get a better distribution of the burden of this by making this just by compressing, like by having taxes and then compressing the burden out of the existing
Yeah, I guess it would be more.
system, or expanding it right in the right way along the income
But right
distribution.
now you're making them pay the 5,000, and then you figure out what extra.
Yeah.
But then there shouldn't be any extra tax, because wasn't the amount you figured? Well, I guess
No,
it's
you have
low.
to. There, it's the taxes are slowly going to increase as the new cohorts sort of get into the new guys are again generating. So the tax would slowly increase and then sort of balance at a certain level after a couple of periods. But still, I mean, that's a pretty good idea.
Problem is that some will just leave and go to Canada.
Yeah, no, probably. So I think I need to rush a little on that. So that's where we are at. Then for the short run cohorts, we already see that there's a huge heterogeneity in the effect. So degree tax performs best in the short run. The gradient tax performs a little less, and the comprehensive tax performs significantly less. We're going to find out in a second why that is. But then sort of as the economy starts expanding, and the economy is especially expanding in this scenario here, welfare is going to increase in the future because you increase the capital stock, you're on the dynamically efficient side of the economy. Increasing the capital stock is a good thing. So most of these long-run welfare effects you see here, especially in the comprehensive tax system, are going to be due to intergenerational redistribution.
Excuse me.
Yes, if it's quick.
Huh?
If it's quick.
I'm going to ask it.
Okay. So I really need to get out at least 2 of the results, and I just have 5 minutes left. Okay, so aggregate welfare measure, as I said before, let's say the beauty of these transfers is that we can easily aggregate them up across different cohorts because we have a price sort of for intertemporal price. We use the interest rate in the initial equilibrium to actually discount the future transfers to cohorts. And then finally, we're going to end up with sort of a stock of welfare effects, which we're going to transform into an annuity that pays out sort of throughout the whole transition, and again related to consumption, to aggregate consumption in the initial equilibrium. So what is the measure going to tell you? This measure is going to tell you if it's like 0.5%, you could increase consumption in every period of the transition by aggregate consumption by 0.5%. That's the interpretation. As I said before, these effects are not super large, in part because you're trading off different channels here. We find that the comprehensive tax system is going to perform worse than the mortgage loan system. The graduate tax system performs slightly better. The degree tax system performs even a little better on that. So the question is, okay, where do these effects come from? And we're trying to decompose these effects. When thinking about sort of whatever is going on here a little more carefully, you're going to figure out that there are actually 5 effects at work here. One would be you improve risk sharing across people exposed that go into education, right? So this is going to be a positive effect on welfare. If you have, for example, a comprehensive tax system, you are engaging in some kind of regressive distribution because you're taking part of the burden of educations and putting it on the people who have no education. So this is going to be a negative effect present especially in the comprehensive, but also potentially in the graduate tax system. You're going to have negative work incentives because you're taxing people. Education incentives is ex ante, it's unclear, right? As I said before, it's unclear whether people stay out of education because it was just too risky, and if you partially complete markets, more people go into education. This is going to be positive, but you could also drive it too far and get all these not so productive people into the education sector that you would actually not like to be there, and then welfare is going to decrease again. And we have a tiny general equilibrium effect at work here because general equilibrium leads interest rates to decrease. And when interest rates decrease, liquidity constraints are going to be less binding. It's not going to be terribly important here, but just for the sake of completeness, this is going to be present. And how do we disentangle all these effects? We run basically our economy using a couple of different assumptions. Using a small open economy without factor price movements, assuming that education choice is just something fixed at initial equilibrium values, and just making repayments contingent on income, but letting them be perceived as a lump sum tax to just get out the distortion effects. And by doing so, we can basically calculate any of these different effects where we find that sort of the redistribution effect, which comprises both the risk sharing and the regressive redistribution effect, we cannot really disentangle them, unfortunately, at least not so far, is going to be negative for the CT system, which tells you that sort of regressive redistribution from the educated to the non-educated is going to be a major thing here, basically depressing aggregate welfare, while sort of the degree tax system is providing you with almost only consumption insurance and hardly any regressive redistribution, and therefore performs best along this dimension. Work incentives are kind of the same across all systems. It's still a little puzzling initially, right? Because you would think if you broaden a tax base, that might potentially increase increase welfare because you can lower tax rates. Turns out that sort of taxing these high, very rich people that have only 6 years of education is not so harmful. Also because a lot of they are the good learners on the job, so a lot of their human capital, a lot of their labor hours is going to be due to them being good learners on the job rather to them just paying 2% taxes. Education incentive effect, as I said, we do see a hump shape here. So the graduate tax system can actually sort of generate, it's minor, right? But can generate the largest effect here. And then when we move to the comprehensive tax system, we see that downward slope, basically because we're creating inefficiently high levels of education. And general equilibrium is not surprisingly tiny, but almost the same. And if we sum up all these effects, we're going to end up at this point here. So we can look at hybrid systems where only parts of the payments are replaced. I refer you to the paper for that. So that's essentially what we found. Thanks so much for now for your comments. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Marco, you want to pose a question?
Quick question. Your additional 2% tax, do you start from 0 and go to 2%, or do you have a tax?
We do have an income tax already. That's just sort of the tax you just leave it on top of your income.
Basically, let me start from, this is a general equilibrium paper, and I think one of the contributions of the paper is that it does something that is not easy to do. It kind of characterizes transitional dynamics and does a welfare analysis across cohorts and viability. So this is kind of ambitious that way, and in order to be so ambitious, sometimes you have to kind of cut some corners, and that kind of say which corners matter more than others, which ones, in my view, matter more than others. But let's start from the production technology. So the production technology actually is this. There is a Cobb-Douglas essentially in capital and labor. And labor is basically an aggregate. And this aggregate is actually linear. So basically the assumption here is that you can linearly substitute efficiency units. And how do you produce these efficiency units? Well, you produce them with human capital. You have an intensive margin choice, so you choose labor. And then you have a shock, right? You don't have any control on this random component, but you as an individual have control on these two components, right? And you can think of a system like this that you can perturb with policy. So think about policies as perturbations. And these perturbations will change your choice of H and your choice of L. And there is a trade-off in this choice. So sometimes you say, okay, I can push up my efficiency units with H, but my labor supply will be perturbed. And to a large extent, the paper is about this. Now, there is a normative question, and there is a positive question in the paper. So the normative question is how should we finance and or insure risk human capital investments, right? Like I put a sunk cost in this investment, and I have bumpy returns later on over my life cycle. And it turns out that the answer that the authors give is like, degree taxes are kind of good from the welfare point of view. So there is a definite answer from the paper. And there is a positive aspect. So who wins from any given policy change? And I kind of like this because it's ambitious in a way, right? It's not that I work with these kind of models. I know how painful they can be. And how, when they ask you to do one change, it can take 6 months. And, so they do it. They kind of say, look, there is an intergenerational comparison here, and it can be key. Now, the environment is simplified, as I said. So and the simplifications are helpful to characterize the dynamics in a transparent way. So what you get is that, first of all, there are no families. Somebody asked, like, is there heterogeneity in wealth? Or here, no, there's no transfers, there's no ex-ante heterogeneity, there's no lottery for parents, right? So you take out a layer of risk right there. And there's no borrowing except for schooling. And all schooling, given that there are no families, is financed through these loans. But beyond schooling, there is a binding constraint. You can't go negative. So this will have a first-order effect on welfare. We know that, right? And there's a production with perfect substitutability of education-specific effective labor. So these are kind of corners that are cut. I have a bunch. I could go through a laundry list. This is a complex model by its nature. It's not that it's a fault of the model. It's just the complexity comes with the task. And I have a kind of a laundry list of comments, but I'll give them to you possibly for future work. What are the contributions? What does this buy you? Well, it buys you that you can actually kind of study a very old kind of mechanism. So Friedman, 1962, Capitalism and Freedom, like, discussing equity financing, right? And saying like, this is tantamount to slavery perhaps, and perhaps we'll never do that, and perhaps we shouldn't. But you could think of people buying shares in highly promising, people do it for footballers, for soccer players, right? You kind of go to South America and, people actually buy shares in promising young kids who might actually go and play in Europe and make millions and millions of dollars. So the other contribution is that transitional dynamics with slow-moving stocks. And you have two slow-moving stocks, so like human and physical capital. And now, it's almost 20 years since these papers that I read as a grad student. And, this is literally a Ekman, Locker, and Tabor kind of exercise. With some additional features. And then you do welfare analysis for different cohorts, which is extremely interesting. And it's a clear illustration of the role of the progressive taxation as a risk-sharing device. So this is really Stiglitz all over again, right? It's like, to what extent taxation provides risk-sharing and so on and so forth. Now, as I said, rather than going through a laundry list, let me make just 3 simple points. And perhaps this will, and some of them might be suggestions for this paper or for future work. So there is risk human capital investment, and the question could be like, could the existing tax system, as it is right now in the US, be viewed as an imperfect equity financing if we studied in a model with comprehensive taxations? Now, one of the issues, it didn't show you much about the calibration, but the calibration is there is a flat tax, there's no progressive taxation, and in fact, actually, he sets it to 15% both for labor and for capital. So, what you really would like to do when you have such a machinery is to study any additional distortion given the tapestry of already existing distortions, right? And to some extent, this would allow you to actually kind of say, look, can I think of the existing tax, given that we are taxing progressively labor income, and given that there is some imperfect correlation between human capital and income, can the existing tax system, if I kind of superimpose it to my model, be viewed as an imperfect form of equity financing if I have this comprehensive taxation that you have? The other point I will discuss is K versus HC, physical capital versus human capital. This is a very old question. In the 80s, actually, Levarian Weiss, Ekman, Eaton and Rosen, Shelby Rosen was writing about this. There is a way in which you can think about K, human capital, physical capital, and human capital, like Tom Krebs was discussing this morning. These are two ways in which you can smooth the marginal utility of consumption over your life cycle. They are two different instruments. There is an optimal portfolio choice. They carry different risks and different returns. And you, as an individual over the life cycle, make an optimal choice of how you want to smooth your marginal utility of consumption. And then the third point, it's an empirical question. How should we design human capital contingent taxation? And this kind of, what does the government know? How should we proceed? So let me start from the first point. Progressive labor taxes, can we think of these as human capital levies, like duties that you pay when you accumulate human capital? And what kind of distortions are involved, and so on and so forth. So the benchmark, as I said, entails a flat labor tax. The US tax system instead does, to some extent, very imperfectly, link human capital achievement to marginal taxes. Because I'm taxed more, and I have a PhD. Now, probably I'm not the guy who pays most taxes in Canada, but still, there is a correlation. There is a positive question. To what extent does the existing US tax system imply human capital contingent taxation? And to me, that's really one of the most interesting questions you could use your machinery to what extent this is actually already happening. And there is a counterfactual analysis that is very simple. You could do. You could compare the flat tax benchmark to a system similar to the one that is observed in the US. Just, you could do it by putting simply a flat tax with a lump sum transfer, or you could do Gouveia and Strauss, like all the tricks that Gianluca Violante and co-authors have used. But, there are lots of ways to do it very simply. there are, and also the other question is, are there any good example of targeted human capital taxations in other countries? And of course, human capital is a single index, but it also conveys information about what you might want to ask, like, what does the government know? Well, not much, but if you have high human capital, perhaps I can infer something about your ability. The other second point, human versus physical capital. There are two ways of smoothing the marginal utility, as I say. A simple but informative counterfactual could be, how do changing taxes on K affect human capital accumulation? I change the marginal taxation on one of the two instruments, of one of the two technologies I have to smooth marginal utility. How does it affect the use of the other technology? And this is really like an old question, like these papers, I can direct you, like they were paper and pencil paper, but they were very clear results. And the mix of human and physical capital may be key for welfare. So when you do welfare analysis, you might find some interesting things. And then you could have a more normative question. Could one design a loan repayment system based on both human and physical capital? There is so much literature now on wealth inequality, and like so much interest. And the last thing, I have 1 minute, implementing a degree tax. A degree tax, as you guys do it, is based on the years of education. How would one go about designing such a tax in reality, right? Well, there is an imperfect correlation between the length of education and the returns. And should the repayment be contingent on duration of return? Should I tax MBAs because they make millions of dollars? Or should I actually give them incentives to make millions of dollars? That's a high return investment, right? I'm not sure, it's not obvious to me that I want to tax that kind of investment. Would such a system significantly alter the incentive to pursue high return degrees? And someone before was asking exactly this kind of question. So some discussion of different possibilities and existing programs would really make the results more compelling. But I thought it was a very interesting read for me.
Okay, thanks very much for that excellent discussion. I think there's a lot of valid points in there, some of which we can grasp probably in the more short run, some of which are going to require a lot more work. But I basically agree with that you said. There are more questions for now. Yes.
So basically, this degree tax completely substitute the mortgage tax.
Yes.
I was wondering whether you played around whether it's possible, whether it's too difficult, but whether there could be an endogenous intake of this degree tax, because I'm thinking there could be some asymmetric. You could have the high ability prefer the mortgage tax and the low ability prefer the degree tax, and at the end this will create problems. That's kind of what I think in the UK they're talking about with the implementation of basically the degree tax or something.
At least I think we could sort of in the long run study sort of the welfare implications by different sort of types of ability, which would already inform you about that. We what we played around with was basically just substituting like 50% or 30% of the mortgage loan system, which with each of the different systems turns out sort of in terms of aggregate welfare, then like going to a full degree tax is actually the optimum thing you would want to do. When you have graduate taxes, you would only want to replace about 70%. If you would have comprehensive taxes, it would just completely stay with the mortgage.
The question is whether it's...
But it's not individual. It's from an aggregate perspective. It's from an individual perspective.
Yeah, the question is whether it's feasible to have the full degree tax, in the sense that some people just wouldn't take that.
Yeah.
And they're probably higher bill.
Yeah.
So when you responded to Jim's question about to what extent governments can encourage or discourage people with different learning abilities to take educations, I think your current degree-specific tax system is to some extent trying to deal with that asymmetric information problem, that it is, as part of the optimal design, trying to create differential incentives by learning ability as to what degree to take. And it seems like, I mean, the optimal system would be trying to do that in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah, it's true. So probably given the constraint that government cannot observe ability, expose conditioning sort of on the outcome, but not only on the labor income outcome, but also using that information on education, because that's even going to tell you more about the individual ability, right? Because the combination, like income still has a lot of variance to it. And if you have a low income person, that might even be someone who has, I don't know, is an MBA, but it's just like completely unlucky in the market, right? And then combining these two sets of information, I guess, is exactly right. What you want to do, and it's sort of the best way for the government to infer individual ability.
It might be worthwhile being a little bit more
it's
explicit
true,
about
which
what it is
that
that the mechanism is trying to do.
Yeah. Okay.
Great. Any more questions? Oh.
So one quick question. When you did the transitional path, you showed this dip before it goes up, right? When you went from one policy to another. So presumably you're going to an environment where the return to human capital is higher, right? So I would have thought then that given learning by doing, you have to work more in order to get more human capital. But is that swamped by the fact that people are going back to school?
If people stay in school, so there's two technologies here, right? There's the learning or doing, which would be staying in school. When you stay in school, you work less, right, in the labor market, so labor is going to go down, and then in the end you're going to have higher human capital. And that's basically what this whole thing is, what the whole reform is impacting here. So you get this initial fall in labor productivity and stuff because people are just going to stay out of the labor force and consistently get higher.
How about the people working on the job? Are they spending more L?
They might, I mean, since that must have an impact on the wage rate, I would guess they should consistently work longer hours, which would also mean that sort of they would profit more from learning on the job, actually. But that would have to sort of really calculate that in detail. But it's fine to